What kind of man keeps riding when a child is crying for help on the first morning of the new year? The question rose like a ghost in the winter air, drifting across the Montana plains in 1877, where the land lay silent beneath a hard, colorless sky. Frost gripped every blade of grass, and the wind carried a cold that felt sharp enough to cut through bone. James Walker rode through that quiet, a leather patch covering the left eye he had lost years ago. The scar beneath it a reminder he could never fully ignore. He didn't sing. He didn't pray. He simply rode forward because forward was the only direction he trusted anymore. Buck, his gray horse, moved steadily beneath him, hooves thudding softly over frozen ground. James carried only what he needed: a rifle, a bedroll, a worn Bible he never opened. He had spent 3 years drifting across the West, choosing solitude over the danger of being known. A man who stayed in one place too long had time to remember, and memory was the one enemy he had never learned to defeat. Since the illness in Missouri that had taken his wife and child, distance had become his faith. The open horizon, his only home. Then the sound came. At first it seemed like only the wind pushing through the ravine. But then it came again, thin, broken, trembling with fear. A child's cry. James stiffened. Instinct told him to keep riding. Trouble often wore the voice of someone helpless, and he had no room left in his life for complications. He tried to let the sound fade into the cold, empty distance, but it did not fade. It returned, sharper now, desperate. He pulled back the reins. Buck slowed, then stopped. For a long moment James sat motionless, one eye on the horizon, his jaw locked tight. He knew the choice before him. He could keep riding and forget this moment before nightfall, or he could turn back and risk stepping once again into the fragile territory of caring. He exhaled, quiet and resigned, then turned the horse toward the sound. They rode across the frozen plain until he saw her. A girl, no older than 8, stood beside a leaning fence post, shivering in a coat far too thin for winter. Her cheeks were wet with tears, but her eyes were fierce with the last scraps of courage she had left. "Please," she whispered, "please help." Her name was Emily Carter. The words tumbled from her in broken breaths. Her mother had been sick for 3 days, fever, delirium, slipping in and out of consciousness. Her father had died the winter before, and the neighbors had turned away since then, each claiming hardship of their own. She had been alone. She had shouted into the plains until her voice nearly vanished, hoping someone, anyone, might hear. James listened in silence, but inside him something old and painful stirred. A memory of another house, another sickness, another family he could not save. For years he had built walls around that grief, but now, standing before this frightened child, those walls cracked. Without another word, he lifted Emily into the saddle and turned Buck toward the worn cabin in the distance. The house leaned tiredly into the wind, its wood darkened by weather and time. No smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, the air felt heavy and still. Sarah Carter lay beneath a pile of blankets, her skin flushed with fever, her lips cracked, her breathing shallow. She whispered fractured words that belonged to dreams, not waking life. James moved with quiet urgency. He fetched water. He cooled her fever. He coaxed small sips past her dry lips. Emily stayed close, watching everything, terrified of losing the only parent she had left. The winter night closed in around the cabin, pressing against the walls like a living thing, and James knew this woman would not survive much longer without help. He lit a fire and stayed beside the bed, telling himself this was temporary. One night, one act of mercy. Then he would return to the road and the safety of being no one to anyone. Emily finally slept, worn out by fear and exhaustion, but James remained awake, listening to the crackle of the fire and the fragile rhythm of Sarah's breathing. As the hours crept past, the question returned to him, quiet, relentless, impossible to ignore. What kind of man keeps riding when a child is crying for help? By the time the first pale light of morning reached the plains, James Walker already knew the answer. Whatever else he had become through years of loss and wandering, he could no longer be that man. The fever did not break with the morning light. If anything, it seemed stronger, clinging to Sarah like a shadow that refused to leave. Her breathing came in short, uneven waves, each one sounding weaker than the last. Emily watched her mother with silent terror, and James could feel the weight of that fear settle heavily in the room. He had seen sickness before, seen how quickly it could steal a life away, and he knew, with a grim certainty, that what he was doing was not enough. He stepped outside for a moment, letting the cold air steady him. The world beyond the cabin was quiet, the New Year sun low and pale in the winter sky. 8 miles. That was the distance to Silver Creek. 8 miles of frozen ground, harsh wind, and uncertainty. But there was a doctor there, and that, right now, meant hope. He went back inside and knelt beside Emily. His voice stayed calm because it had to. "I have to ride to town," he told her. "Your mother needs a doctor. I'll be back as soon as I can." The girl's small hands clenched in the fabric of his coat. For a moment, he saw not only fear, but trust. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll watch her," she whispered. "I promise." He left more wood by the fire, made sure water was near the bed, then saddled Buck and turned toward the distant line of hills. The wind cut cold against his face as he rode, but he pushed the horse harder than he normally would have, his one good eye fixed on the road ahead. Every minute mattered now. Every mile felt like a gamble. Silver Creek appeared slowly, a scattering of buildings huddled against the winter like they too feared the cold. James tied Buck outside the small medical office and stepped inside without knocking. The man behind the desk looked up, spectacles perched low on his nose. Dr. William Harper was mid-40s, tired around the eyes, the sort of man who had long ago learned not to waste words. "I need you," James said simply. "A woman, fever, 3 days, she's barely conscious." The doctor hesitated. He asked the usual questions. How far? How urgent? Who would pay? Practical concerns, more about survival than cruelty. James understood that. The frontier did not reward charity, but understanding did not ease the sting when the doctor said he couldn't leave without knowing his work would be compensated. James reached into his coat and placed everything he had on the table. $46, his past 3 months of drifting wages. It was all he owned. "That'll cover it," he said. The doctor studied him for a moment. One eye, weathered face. Exhaustion carried like armor. Then Harper nodded once, business giving way to something quieter. "Let's go." They rode hard back toward the Carter cabin. James could feel his heart beating faster as they approached. He had left a child alone with fear, and although he had not had a choice, the thought gnawed at him. When the cabin finally came into view, smoke rising thinly from the chimney, relief washed through him. But only for a moment. Inside, Sarah was worse. Her skin burned with fever. Her lips were cracked, her breathing shallow and rattled. Emily had done everything he had told her to do, her small face pale with worry and exhaustion. But the sickness had tightened its grip. Dr. Harper went to work immediately. He checked her lungs. He examined her pulse. He listened. Then he spoke the word James had been expecting, though he had hoped desperately not to hear. "Pneumonia." It hung in the air like a sentence. The doctor prepared medicine, mixed powders, and explained everything with measured calm. Sarah needed fluids, rest, warmth, constant care. The next 24 hours would decide everything. Emily stayed close to her mother's side. James worked silently, carrying wood, heating water, doing whatever was needed without being asked. He felt the strain of every passing minute, the helplessness of knowing that sometimes even your best efforts weren't enough, but he refused to leave. Not again, not this time. The hours blurred into each other. Snow drifted outside. The fire snapped and hissed. Sarah's breathing fought its uncertain battle. At one point she opened her eyes, just for a moment, and James saw in them confusion, fear, and something close to gratitude before exhaustion pulled her back under. Emily held her mother's hand and whispered small, broken reassurances, as if her voice alone might keep her anchored to the world. The doctor stayed until he was sure the medicine had taken hold. Before leaving, he looked at James and spoke plainly. She wouldn't have made it without help. Now, we wait. James nodded. Waiting was something he understood. He had waited years for grief to fade. It never had. Now, he waited for life to hold on. And somehow, that felt different. It felt like fighting. Night fell again. James sat near the bed. Emily finally slept, exhausted, her head resting against her folded arms. The cabin glowed softly in the firelight, warmer than it had been in days. Outside, winter pressed on, indifferent to the small battle taking place within these walls. Then, near dawn, the fever broke. It didn't disappear all at once. It loosened, softened. Sarah's breathing steadied, and the flush faded slowly from her cheeks. When her eyes opened, really opened, she looked around the room with clarity for the first time in days. She saw Emily. She saw James, and tears welled gently in her eyes. Weakly, she whispered her thanks. Then she looked away, struggling between gratitude and wounded pride. A widow on the frontier never wanted to be a burden. James understood that. He spoke quietly, his tone steady and honest. Needing help doesn't make you weak. She didn't answer right away. But something in her expression softened. Over the next days, Sarah regained strength little by little. The danger did not vanish, but hope finally had a place inside the cabin. Emily moved lighter now, smiling more than she cried. And James remained, longer than he had ever planned, longer than he ever thought he would stay anywhere again. Because the truth had already taken root inside him. He wasn't finished here. And walking away would no longer be the easy choice. Winter did not loosen its grip simply because Sarah had survived the worst of the fever. The snow deepened, the wind sharpened, and the days stretched long and cold across the Montana plains. Outside, the world felt suspended between silence and storm, while inside the Carter cabin, life returned only slowly, one fragile breath at a time. Sarah could sit up now, though exhaustion still clung to her like a second skin. Emily rarely left her side, moving with the quiet care of a child who had learned too early how easily the world could break. And James remained there with them, a presence that felt steady, grounded, and strangely necessary. He had told himself that when the doctor left, he would leave too. That had always been the rule. Help when you could, disappear before anyone expected more. But when he stepped out onto the porch that morning and looked across the white horizon, he did not see escape. He saw risk. He saw a widow still too weak to chop wood or carry water. He saw a child who could not survive another winter alone. And he felt something he had not felt in a long time, a sense of responsibility that anchored him in place. By the time Dr. Harper returned to check on Sarah, the decision was already made. Even if James had not spoken it aloud. The doctor confirmed what James already knew. Sarah would not be able to handle the winter alone. Work had to be done, supplies had to be gathered, and winter had no mercy for those who fell behind. The doctor looked at James for a long, assessing moment before nodding once, as if accepting that the matter had been settled without a word needing to be said. On the frontier, promises weren't made with speeches. They were made with actions. And James had already begun. He started with the roof. Snow had piled thick along the weak beams, threatening collapse. He climbed up, cold biting at his exposed cheek, and cleared it before reinforcing the frame with timber he cut from the nearby woods. Then he repaired the door, tightened the hinges, sealed the cracks. He rebuilt the chicken coop that winter storms had nearly torn apart. He hunted deer in the wooded ravines and taught Emily how to help clean and salt the meat for storage. Every task was practical, necessary, measured. Yet beneath every motion ran an unspoken truth. He was not simply working to keep them alive. He was building something steadier, something that looked dangerously close to belonging. Inside, life found a new rhythm. Sarah moved carefully around the cabin, still weak but growing stronger each day. Sometimes she would pause to watch James work, quiet gratitude in her expression. She said little, but she always made sure there was coffee when he returned from the cold. Emily spoke more freely, now that fear no longer ruled her every breath. She followed James outside, eager to learn, determined never again to feel as helpless as she had when her mother was dying. He taught her to ride buck, her small hands gripping the reins with serious concentration. He showed her how to read the wind, how to judge tracks in the snow, how to keep her balance firm and her eyes forward. Together they built a sense of safety out of simple routines. Yet safety was not the same as peace. At night, when the cabin fell quiet and the fire sank low, James often found himself awake, staring into the flames. Memories crept in like shadows. Laughter once shared, a child's small hand in his, the sound of coughing that grew worse, the graves he had left behind because staying there had felt impossible. He had chosen the road to escape that pain, believing movement would numb it. Now, in the stillness of this small home, the grief breathed again. Sometimes Sarah would wake and see him there, silent and distant. And though she did not ask questions, she seemed to understand that they were both people who had lost more than they ever intended to. Slowly, respect deepened into something warmer, though neither dared name it. The winter wore on. Storms came and passed. There were days the wind screamed across the plains and the snow stacked so high against the cabin walls that the world outside disappeared entirely. During those days, the three of them stayed close to the fire. James read aloud from Robinson Crusoe, his steady voice filling the small room. The story of survival on a lonely island struck something deep inside each of them, a reflection of their own isolation and the stubborn hope that life could be rebuilt from ruins. Emily would lean against her mother. Sarah would close her eyes, listening, letting the sound of James's voice soften the sharp edges of her thoughts. It was not family, not yet, but it was something close. As the weeks passed, the town began to notice. When James rode into Silver Creek for supplies, people greeted him with nods that held more weight than simple politeness. They had once watched the Carter household from a distance, unwilling or unable to help. Now they saw a man quietly protecting what remained. There were whispers, questions about the one-eyed drifter who had somehow stayed. Some respected him, some mistrusted him, but no one doubted that he belonged to that cabin now, at least for the winter. James tried to ignore what the future might bring. His rule had always been clear: never stay long enough for roots to take hold. But every day he found it harder to picture riding away. Emily had begun to look for him first whenever something frightened her. Sarah's expression softened when he entered the room, like the tension in her shoulders released just a little. And he, in turn, felt something unfamiliar. Purpose. A reason to rise each morning that wasn't simply to outrun memory. One night, when the snow fell soft and relentless beyond the window, Sarah spoke quietly while Emily slept. "You don't have to stay," she said. "You've already done more than anyone else would have." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," but he did not leave. Because somewhere along the long stretch of winter days, the question that had haunted him since the first morning of the year had changed. It was no longer about what kind of man could keep riding when a child cried for help. Now it was simpler, deeper, and far more dangerous. What kind of man walks away from a home he has begun to care about? James Walker had spent years believing himself incapable of belonging anywhere. Yet here, in a small cabin on a frozen plain, with a recovering widow and a brave child depending on him, he began to understand a truth he had long resisted. Sometimes staying is the greater act of courage. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, almost cautiously, as if testing whether the land had endured enough. Snow receded from the edges of the fields. Thin streams of meltwater traced wandering paths through the frozen ground. The air softened, losing its sharp winter bite, and the plains slowly began to breathe again. For months, the Carter cabin had been wrapped tightly in the stillness of survival. Now, as the world thawed, so did the lives inside it. Sarah could walk farther each day without tiring. Color returned to her cheeks. Her laughter, rare, soft, almost shy, began to appear in small moments, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Emily followed the season's lead, racing out into the field with a joy she had been too afraid to feel for so long. And James, who had once believed that movement was the only way to stay whole, found himself rooted to the same small patch of land, not out of duty anymore, but out of something far more difficult to name. The rhythm of their days changed. There was work to be done, repairing fences, preparing soil, tending to animals, and gathering what little the winter had left unbroken. James worked with steady focus, tools in hand, sleeves rolled up, the leather patch over his left eye catching the light now and then. Sarah often joined him outside, leaning against a post when she grew tired, talking with him about small, ordinary things. The conversations were simple: weather, crops, Emily's schooling. But beneath them ran a deeper current. They were learning one another, not as rescuer and patient, not as stranger and widow, but as two people who had been walking alone for far too long. Yet with spring's warmth came something else: memory. Grief had been buried under winter's urgency, but now it rose like thawing earth. James found himself waking in the night again, staring into the quiet darkness, the ache of his past returning with unwelcome clarity. Sarah saw it in the way his shoulders stiffened sometimes, in the rare moments when his gaze drifted somewhere far beyond the plains. She knew he carried ghosts, just as she did, but she did not press. Instead, she matched his silence with patience. One evening they sat outside while Emily chased the last light of the day across the yard. The sky burned soft shades of gold and rose. A breeze carried the faint scent of new grass. Sarah folded her hands in her lap and spoke gently. "You don't sleep some nights." He didn't answer at first. Then he nodded, not looking at her. "No, not always." She waited. It was an invitation, not a demand. He finally met her eyes, and for once the guardedness slipped. He spoke of Missouri, of a small home filled once with warmth, of illness that arrived quietly and left him alone beside two graves, of the man he had become afterward, a drifter hiding behind an empty road and a worn Bible he could not bear to open. When he finished, the silence between them did not feel heavy or uncomfortable. It felt honest. Sarah took a slow breath, then told him her own story. Losing her husband, watching the world narrow into fear and debt and struggle, fighting pride even when help might have saved her sooner. She spoke not for sympathy, but for truth. In that moment, something shifted. They were no longer two people helping each other survive. They were two broken hearts recognizing familiar shadows. Days continued. The feelings they both tried not to acknowledge slowly strengthened. James found himself looking forward to Sarah's quiet smile when he walked through the door. Sarah felt steadier when he was near, not because she needed rescuing anymore, but because she trusted him. Still, neither of them rushed toward the word that hovered between them. Love, in the wild country, was not a thing to speak carelessly. One afternoon, Emily practiced riding Buck under James's careful guidance, while Sarah stood near the fence. The child laughed, fearless again for the first time in years. Sarah glanced toward James, gratitude softening into something deeper. She realized then that the man who had once planned to leave as soon as winter ended had woven himself into their lives so fully that imagining the world without him felt impossible. But love is rarely free from fear. James worried that staying meant opening himself to loss once more. Sarah feared that hope might be a fragile illusion winter could still shatter. And so they moved carefully, step by step, letting trust grow where words did not. One night in early spring, with the sky clear and the stars sharp above them, James lingered on the porch. Sarah joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. They watched the quiet land together. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I meant to leave when the snow melted." "I know," she replied, "but I don't want to." The words hung between them, simple and unpolished. yet carrying the weight of a choice he had never made before. Sarah turned toward him. Her voice trembled only slightly. "Then don't." There was no need for more. No dramatic declarations, no sudden promises. Just an understanding that two lives, once shattered, had begun to fit together in a way neither had expected. From that evening on, they walked a new path, not rushing, not denying. Emily sensed it too, not through anything said out loud, but through the comfortable warmth that had settled over the home. She began to treat James not just as a protector, but as someone who truly belonged. As spring deepened, the fields grew green, the sky brightened, and laughter returned to the Carter home like a guest finally welcomed back. The shadows of loss did not disappear entirely. They never do, but they no longer ruled the house. Instead, love, fragile but determined, had begun to take root beneath open skies. And James Walker, once a wandering man with one eye and no home, realized that the greatest freedom he had ever known was not found in the endless road ahead, but in the courage to stay. By the time spring settled fully across the plains, the Carter homestead no longer felt like a place fighting to survive. It felt like a place becoming whole again. The air carried warmth instead of warning. The soil turned dark and rich beneath their hands as they worked the fields together, planting seeds not only for crops, but for a life they now quietly shared. Emily laughed more easily, running barefoot through the grass, and Sarah's strength had fully returned, though a quiet humility still lingered in her eyes. James stayed, not because duty held him, but because his heart finally had somewhere to rest. The leather patch over his left eye no longer felt like a mark of what he had lost, but a reminder of what he had endured to reach this moment. Each day he rose with purpose, fixing fences, trading in town, tending to the land. Each night he sat with Sarah on the porch, the sky stretched wide above them, and silence no longer felt lonely. The town changed toward them too. Silver Creek had watched from a distance all winter, but when spring came, something shifted. People offered help. Supplies were shared more freely. Perhaps it was respect, perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that a man who stayed through a winter like that was no stranger anymore. Dr. Harper visited often, partly to ensure Sarah's health remained steady, partly because the cabin now carried warmth instead of dread. Even he, a man tempered by years of frontier practicality, smiled more easily in their presence. Love, when it finally came into the open, did not arrive with dramatic declarations. It slipped in like dawn, almost unnoticed, until suddenly it was everywhere. It lived in the way Sarah's hand brushed James's when they worked side by side. It lived in the calm that spread through the cabin whenever he stepped inside. It lived in his voice when he read to Emily at night, steady and strong, like a promise he didn't quite know how to speak. Then, one evening, beneath a sky painted with soft streaks of lavender and gold, James asked Sarah to marry him. There was no grand speech, only quiet honesty. He told her that he had spent years believing he was destined to remain a drifting shadow, that the road had once been his refuge because it asked nothing of him. But now, for the first time since Missouri, he wanted to stay because he wanted to belong. He wanted a home. He wanted her. Sarah listened, tears bright in her eyes, and simply nodded, because words would never be enough to hold the meaning of that choice. Emily watched, her heart swelling with relief and joy, as though the world had finally found its proper shape. Their wedding was small. A simple ceremony in town with Dr. Harper as witness and Emily standing proudly beside her mother. The church smelled faintly of wood polish and lilies. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. There were no polished rings, no grand feast, just a handful of people and a promise spoken with quiet certainty. When they walked out as husband and wife, James held Sarah's hand with the same careful reverence he had once used when lifting her from fever's edge. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Life afterward did not become perfect. The frontier never allowed for that. There were storms and lean months and long days of back-breaking work. But there was also warmth in the laughter around the supper table. There was comfort in knowing he would not wake up alone anymore. Emily began calling him James at first. Then, slowly, naturally, without being asked, she called him Pa. The first time she said it, he had to look away for a moment, swallowing hard against the weight of the gift she had given him. Seasons turned, fields grew, and when the following spring arrived, the cabin filled with new life. Sarah gave birth to a son, healthy and crying with fierce determination, as if declaring that he had come into the world to live fully. They named him Michael. Holding the child in his arms, James felt something shift deep inside. The old grief did not vanish, it never would, but it softened into memory rather than open wound. He did not feel haunted anymore. He felt thankful. Life had broken him once. Now it had given him a second chance. With fatherhood returned a sense of purpose that felt both familiar and entirely new. James protected his family with the quiet certainty of a man who understood exactly how fragile happiness could be. But he no longer feared that fragility. Instead, he honored it. Every morning he saddled Buck and rode the fields not to escape, but to provide. Every evening he returned not to silence, but to love. There were nights he still woke and stared into the darkness, but now Sarah was beside him, steady and warm. Sometimes she would reach for his hand without speaking, grounding him back into the present. And somewhere along the long stretch of those days, James realized a truth he had once resisted with all his strength. Freedom had never been about the open road. Freedom was the choice to love, knowing loss might come again. Freedom was the courage to stop running. Freedom was staying. So when the wind swept across the plains and the horizon stretched wide before him, James no longer felt the pull to chase it. He stood on the porch of the cabin, his home, and watched his daughter teach her little brother to walk across the yard. Sarah laughed softly behind him, and he understood that every mile he had wandered had only been leading him here. A family built not from blood alone, but from compassion. A life rebuilt from pain into strength. A home born from courage. And at last, James Walker knew peace, slowly, gently, quietly. The story drifts to a close beneath the soft light of a Montana evening. James Walker, the one-eyed drifter who once believed he belonged nowhere, has finally found a place where the world feels safe again. The road no longer calls to him. The past no longer owns him. Instead, he holds his children close, shares laughter with the woman he loves, and builds each day with patient, steady hands. In choosing to stay, he discovered a truth deeper than any trail he ever followed. That real strength is not surviving alone, but daring to love again after the heart has been broken. The Carter home is no longer a house of illness and fear. It has become a haven of warmth, resilience, and quiet faith in tomorrow. And as the evening wind whispers across the plains, the story fades, not with grand triumph, but with peace, forgiveness, and the quiet promise of a life finally lived without fear. End of article. Good night.